Right now, we have a great panel discussion talking about those two last transformations that Aaron and I spoke about this morning, and the four great transformations that the utility industry is going through. And that's grid modernization and renewable energy. And so I'm so thrilled to welcome to the stage Jill Vassar from Epicenter, Rob Cashel from Energy Market Consulting, Jiang Yaneram from NG, and Michael Conklin from Centerpoint. So please join us up on stage and enlighten us on all the transformations and innovations that are happening right now. Thank you.
Okay, good. I'm going to tell you a couple stories real quick about myself and about Epicenter, because Epicenter's been brought up a couple of times today. And then I'm going to have my panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll carry on the conversation and try to keep you awake until the judges come back with their decisions. Does that sound like a good plan? Okay, good. Thank you, Leslie. I'm glad you think it's a good plan. You may have noticed I have this odd shirt on today. It is a purple T-shirt. I do not normally wear purple T-shirts to professional conferences, but it is the official T-shirt of San Antonio Startup Week, which is happening right down Houston Street. And I want to thank Z-Prime, Jason, and his entire team for welcoming Startup Week participants into this event and the Clean Tech Open event happening on the second floor. So thank you all for that. I've also had some questions about my tennis shoes, which are indeed silver. Thank you. Well, partly I have on sneakers today because it is Startup Week and I'm running up and down Houston Street and have to walk down to another event tonight. But it's also a piece of trivia to know that these shoes are called the Vassar, which is my last name. So of course I had to buy them, right? Okay. I think that's kind of fun. Y'all don't think that's very fun, but oh well. All right, Epicenter. Epicenter is a nonprofit based here in San Antonio, and we are all about the future of energy. We do three things. The first thing we do is what we call thought leadership, but it's a different kind of thought leadership than what we're experiencing here today, which is really for industry and startups talking to industry. We try to translate what's happening in the energy industry to the general business community, because we think there's opportunities for other industries to leverage what's happening in energy for their own benefit, and so we try to make those connections. The second thing we do is run an incubator and accelerator. You'll hear from our director, Andy Littlejohn, in a little bit about our program. And then the third thing we do is what we call advisory services. There was a lot of conversation today about the relationship between utilities and startups and how to manage that process, and we are an entity that can help do that. We have contracts with utilities to essentially manage their innovation pipelines, and we help translate all the issues that have been delineated today about the challenges for utilities. We help translate that to the startups and position the startups in a way that they can be successful as they engage the utility industry. So that's a quick overview, and I've got a great panel here to talk about grid transformation and renewables, so I will ask Rob to go first. I'm sorry you don't have silver shoes, but I'm glad you're here.
I'm sorry I don't have silver shoes either. My name is Rob Cashel. I have traded electricity for a utility for about 12 years. I currently working under a consulting umbrella and along to see that communication made from the consumer to the RTO, to the system operator.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jiang and I work for NG. To describe what NG does, I always use the following sentence. NG is probably the biggest company that you've never heard of. Actually, our roots go back to the Suez Canal. It's the company that actually built the Suez Canal, and we rebranded as NG. It used to be called GDF Suez before. And what we do is basically the largest independent electricity producer in the world. Also provide a lot of services around our customers, but what we like to evolve into is lead zero carbon transition for our customers and provide that as a service. It's a completely different and new business model for us, and we're going through that change. And I'm happy to talk about that. What I specifically do for ENGIE is, as you can tell, I manage the demand risk for our commercial and industrial retail team, and I also manage data and analytics for our community of practice for all of our North America entities.
And I'm Michael Conklin. I work primarily for CenterPoint Energy in Houston. Go Astros!
Yay! Woo! Friendly crowd for you today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we just want to we want to take that championship trophy back. So when Sean asked me if I'd be interested in speaking on this panel, I said that makes a ton of sense because actually although I work for CenterPoint Energy, I'm involved in a lot of things that all intersect with the kinds of things that we're talking about here today. So my primary job is I do government relations with CenterPoint Energy, but I'm also officially an employee of the City of Houston as well, as Director of Advanced Mobility Initiatives. And I also am a member of the startup community in Houston. Station Houston is the group that I'm a member of. And just 2 weeks ago, I launched my first startup, the first one that actually got to launch. And it's a nonprofit called Evolve Houston, which is accelerating the rate of EV adoption in Houston. Our goal is to have 30% of new car sales by 2030. And then lastly, I am also a member of the City of Houston's Smart City Task Force, which is outlining the program that the city and partners will follow for implementing their smart city initiatives.
Great. So we've got a really good, diverse set of backgrounds and expertise, and let's just get started here. So we really want to talk about the breakthrough technologies that are allowing more updating of the grid and keeping it more resilient. And so we have had a conversation going for a couple of weeks now about how we want to approach it. And really, I think we're going to turn it over to Jiang to start to look at this question from the point of view of what the customers are looking for. That's where we'll start.
Thank you. So yes, our customers, and we have a lot of customers, and they always demanded things from us, but that demand has started to shift recently. So definitely gone are the days for safe, affordable, and reliable power. So that's just table stakes now. Obviously, everyone needs that. But our customers are now demanding autonomy, they demand personalized solutions, they demand flexibility, and they demand sustainability and renewables. So to be able to serve those needs, we obviously needed to reinvent ourselves. And that always starts in large corporations with an organizational change. So we've gone through that. We've changed our business model, got rid of all of our thermal assets, and invested that money in renewable electricity generation as well as energy services for our customers, so customer-centric solutions from energy efficiency all the way to battery storage, distributed solar, et cetera. And organizationally, we've changed and we've basically established electricity supply and renewables as our core and created vertical customer engagement models with cities and communities, commercial and industrial, and general contractors and building managers. So those are the three verticals that we engage our customers with. And we've quickly realized that organizational change doesn't actually solve the problem, or it takes time to solve the problem. So what's important is how you engage your customers. And our customers, as I've said, want sustainability and autonomy and those kind of personalized solutions. What we've done very bad as an industry is we like to shove our language through our customers' throats. We very much like to talk about demand response and unit contingency.
Lots of acronyms.
Absolutely. And customers do not care about those things, obviously. I mean, have you ever tried talking about demand response on a dinner table with your kids? I'm sure that's an interesting conversation. Makes it easier to go to sleep, though, so there's benefits. But we've started to engage our customers in a different way. And that's basically, when we're talking to Microsoft, one of our customers, it's really weird when we listen to them and they talk about these things. And we reply to them as, you're not supposed to know anything about that. That's not really your business to know those things. And really, just tell us how much money you're willing to spend and what your goal is, and we'll figure out the rest. What that is creating is a lot of dependency on data to be able to achieve the goals that you mentioned. So as an organization, we've spent a lot of money and effort to create platforms because that's where we think the real value for our business is, on integrating renewables into the grid. So we invested in a software called Darwin, which essentially gathers real-time operational data from all of our renewable assets throughout the world. We've invested in Smart Institutions, which is basically an energy management platform for cities and communities that, again, leverages AI in partnership with C3. But what we've seen as a hurdle is, while we have these kind of solutions, we need these solutions to be able to talk to the distribution operators, because we're only able to solve part of the problem, and the remaining part of the problem is how today's utility needs to evolve to a distribution service orchestrator, which essentially becomes a data clearing house. Unfortunately, none of the data, when it comes to resource planning, congestion, VAR is not even a tradable commodity today. So those kind of data is not really flowing into our platforms for us to be able to innovate and integrate these renewables into the grid more effectively. So that's one hurdle, and that's basically requires a business model change for the utility, which I think is the second hurdle. So today, a utility invests in capital, puts infrastructure on the ground, and essentially collects economic rent from those assets. While what we're talking about is a data clearinghouse, which is a completely different business model, and today's business model for a utility does not really solve that problem or answer that question. So I think that is the second hurdle that needs to be resolved. But once we get there, I think there is a great opportunity for startups to essentially fill the holes in this platform, because we believe we're not the best in everything. Obviously, we want to create the platform, but that platform will be dependent on startups and innovators to come and essentially solve some of the problems, such as basic examples since Amperon was here is load forecasting. We believe we're not going to be the best in load forecasting. Someone else will be. That could be just two guys out of their garage. Can't come up with the best load forecasting algorithm, so we just need to create an opportunity for them to come in and be in this modular design stack.
Okay, so there's tension between what the customers are demanding and what the current infrastructure will allow, and data is going to be a big piece of solving that. Rob, maybe you could comment a little bit about what hurdles might exist to make that a reality. What, from the utility side, has to also be knocked down or reinvented to enable new platforms?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jill. So, as very well explained, Cengiz, this data platform picture, I think this overarching goal would be to take that price signal that your real-time operator, or that, like a ISO, RTO is seeing, and get something that's representative of that all the way to the customer through the different entities in the utility. We heard Josh and Jason this morning mention this siloing, this culture, this challenge of a utility, and I remember a question of, hey, we can't fail, the utility can't make a mistake. All of that, I think, contributing towards this very slow to change, very difficult to adopt innovative strategy. I think as a utility, one of the most useful things would be that the innovation group, whether it's AI, whatever technology it is, that helps bridge that gap, that buys a win with like your system operator and draws them into this innovation conversation and says, hey, we can help you do your job better. And then secondly, I think we need to look at what each group is incentivized to do. Are there performance metrics? Your system operator wants to keep the ACE at 0, whether the RTOs, LMP, the price signal is really high or really low, in which case you actually might want to transact. So as we look at this innovation and this data platform, which ultimately I think allows the customer and the load to be a resource to the utility, we've got to build that translation out. We've got to build that culture of how do we share information? What's our planning process? Is our planning process aligned to do this right now? And I would submit that in many cases it may not be, and we may be missing, we're using an older system, like we've talked about, and the utility's doing the best that they can, but I think innovation, there's room to come in and to say, here is an opportunity to align these different groups, which all impact this conversation from the power plant and the wires in the ground to the customer.
Thank you. Michael, we've talked a little bit about data already. I'd like to hear your perspective on data, and Rob touched on AI and using that data. Do you see other technologies out there that will support the proper exploitation of that data to serve customers? Are there other technologies that you're seeing out there that will influence this transition?
Well, I confess I'm not really the most technical person, and while I do use data regularly, that's not really my space. I'm more on the policy side, and where my focus is if we're talking about grid modernization, then we're trying to find where you have a need and a solution, and you're really talking about the intersection of three parties. You've got customers, you've got your utility, and you've got regulators, and every one of those has to be satisfied. So the great thing about data is, all of the good policy positions and proposals that you're going to put forward are going to be based on some demonstration of value from socialized assets, where there is value created for the customer being shared with the customer, and that can be sort of like an NPV, or it can be a resiliency or something like that. So the great thing about all these data technologies is it does provide greater insight into the values of these things. And in things that some of what Rob's talking about, some of these might not even be customer things. This is just the utility has the ability to get more efficient in its own operations.
All good points. Let's talk about the regulatory environment. When you start talking about grid modernization, what do y'all see in the regulatory environment are they keeping up with the pace of change? Are they preventing the adequate pace of change to meet the needs if y'all have seen them? Who's doing it well? Well, maybe we don't want to call out anybody in particular, but I think the regulatory framework can enable some of these transitions, or it can hinder it. So what do you see happening there? Anyone? Michael, you might want to...
I'll take a stab at that one. So is grid modernization happening fast enough? And that totally depends on which of those groups you're asking. So the regulators are always going to move slowly because they need a reason to move. They tend towards conservatism. The desires of consumers are going to be the fastest moving thing of all. They're going to compare whatever they get from the utility to what they're used to getting from competitive services that are not nearly as regulated as a utility is. And then from the utility's perspective, they probably want things to change faster than the regulators as well, because grid modernization for them is also about responding to competitive, sometimes almost existential threats from new technologies that could really upend their business model. So I think that consumers and utilities would both agree that grid modernization, we'd like to see it happen faster. Regulators want to make sure that customer value is protected and the ratepayer is protected along the way. And I see that when it comes to these, we're talking about smart cities, smart utilities, grid modernization, being able to get the key stakeholders together and to see the value and to be able to advise and guide the thinking of the regulators, and they need that. I think that those kinds of relationships really help move these technologies, progress, conversations forward.
Changus?
Yeah, I want to add, and I hope I don't get into trouble for saying these things, but so let me put a disclaimer. This is just my personal opinion, not necessarily NG's opinion. I think, yeah, I agree. It's going to be slow. The regulatory framework is not necessarily going to be at the same pace as the innovations that are happening. But I'm actually glad to see at certain pockets in certain states there are really good things happening. So if you go back to the data question that we tried to answer earlier, I see, for example, the state of New Hampshire. They are working with the Office of the Consumer Advocate to actually create a platform that's above the utilities within New Hampshire. So it is something similar to we have in Texas, like Smart Meter Texas, which is where all the smart meter data is being collected into one data repository. But it's even bigger than that. So entire customer data for the entire state is being planned to put into one repository, which I think is the essential thing we need to be able to do all the things that Rob mentioned. So there are things happening. There's a process going on in New York, which we're working with consultants to be able to create some reports to give to the Public Utility Commission. There's good things happening in DC, the Distributed Energy Resource Authority. Again, they're trying to create a statewide data repository to be able to publish where do we need to deploy the DERs, where do we need to put the renewables, and how do we feed that into the state and essentially connect it with the customers. So those things are happening, but I will also say that it's not big enough, it's not widespread enough, and actually we did have a podcast session recorded last week with Aaron and Dylan. And I said during that podcast, regulators also need to be a little bit more brave. You know, we've suffered from that in Europe as a European utility. You know, we have 3 nukes in Belgium, and we've always also defended the same type of thing as, you know, these need to be put into the rate. We need to recover all of our costs for running these units. And regulator one day said, you know, the game is over. These are not your assets. These are the people's assets. They're paying for it. So you're going to have to find another revenue stream for your business. So I'm not saying we should do that here, but that was how much they were brave, and that definitely changed the way the market in Belgium. And similar things could and potentially should happen in the US as well.
Other than AI, which seems like an obvious solution to wrangling these data sets, are there other options out there that you've seen or are watching evolve that can help everyone wrangle all this data? And maybe the answer is no, and that's okay.
It is a big challenge. And I think it was Kristen earlier I listened to, she was talking about creating that big data lake for their own organization. You know, since I lead the Committee of Practice for Data, that is also one of the big challenges. Obviously, the amount of data we have is not similar to what they have. But over the past 2 years, we've acquired a lot of companies, and they had their own silos of data that were stored in different environments with different technologies. They had their own tools that they used for their own business. So it was a big challenge for us to essentially we didn't create one data lake, we've essentially created a virtual combination of lakes that sit on the cloud. I think it's fair to say that there's always a technical solution to a technical problem. It just takes time. What was challenging for us is to change the way people think about how they engage with data. So essentially, how do we democratize that data and start innovating different things with people? One thing we try to do in the organization is definitely do not give anyone a title that has the word innovation in it. Because what we've observed is when that happens, people start to think, it's not my job to innovate, it's that guy's job. So if we have 9,000 employees in North America, how do we essentially get 9,000 innovators? We like to call them imaginative builders. And it was our job for this exercise to essentially to be able to connect all of them into the same platform and start innovating. We've also thought about things like data science as a service. Essentially, I don't know if anyone's heard about the product called Data Robot, but essentially you throw a bunch of data in it and you just say, this is my objective function, and it essentially runs through millions of models and tells you, here's the code that you need to use that gives you the optimal solution. So you don't necessarily need to know anything about coding and scripting. You just need to have a problem, and we just offer the solution through that service, essentially.
We've seen several examples today of people that are using data in different ways to tackle different problems, so that's only going to continue to develop. So let me pivot just slightly, and let's talk about the resilience of the grid and how renewables are making it more resilient or have the potential to make it more resilient, and what does that look like? What are the challenges and hurdles?
That's a great question, and the landscape, as I mentioned earlier, is changing in terms of planning. I think at some point the load, along with the renewables and the distributed energy resources, I'm going to inject that in, has to be looked at as a bit of a resource, that almost there's a supply grid on the side of your EVs, of your programmable thermostats, of maybe to the extent of your stoves and your electric dryers, the other two largest household components in terms of consumption. I think Kristen from Exelon said something about these third-party aggregators working towards providing, actually adding to the resilience of the grid by having aggregated distributed load and the ability to send a signal to those customers saying, you know, your resource just got more expensive. And early on, this whole data platform picture, I think, has got to address a rate structure with the utility, and you've got to move from like a time of use rate, which is going to incentivize someone to use electricity based on this time of use, to a real-time pricing signal, which is reflective of what the current state of the RTO or the utility or the balancing area is. So what I think the technology can do, and I think we've seen hints of this in our innovation, I've also seen a lot of people just leaving the space for this, waiting for the utility, waiting for a standardized platform, waiting for a standardized communication from the customer to the generator to the utility of how do we say you can save money by turning off your dryer? Or does it just happen in the background?
Well, I mean, I'll just throw something as well. We talked about VAR, or voltage, essentially, as another potential commodity that hopefully in one day can be traded as well, because all of us have refrigerators at home, presumably. In fact, it is a thermal storage unit. So we can very well, you know, hopefully one day, someone in their home having 2 refrigerators can offer that on the load side as potentially something that could be monetized through voltage control, because if we could make that refrigerator communicate with essentially the service provider's data platform, which eventually talks to the distribution service orchestrator's data platform, there is a value for that refrigerator to run at a single point in time. And again, that's not a tradable commodity. There is no value attributed to it today, but in one day, if we get there, I think that engagement model with the customer is also going to change significantly so that they can start monetizing their own resources at home. It's not just renewables or distributed resources, it's load itself as well. That can play a significant part in the resiliency of the grid.
I'd like to talk a little bit about, you know, Rob, you mentioned the price signals and time of use rates. And, you know, whenever we talk about, you know, making better use of grid resources, time of use rates is always one of those things that can be controversial, but everyone who's sort of been thinking about it is like the price signal. That's obviously what's going to motivate behavior. If not that, then what else? And highlighting, you know, the need to have conversations and engage with regulators, there's often this assumption that time of use rates are something that people wouldn't accept, or that it would be very punishing to certain segments of the population. And I remember talking to a friend, I think it was over at OGE, and he was talking about the experience of when they implemented time of use rates, and their commission said that this would be a problem for low-income customers, these time of use rates. And so they went and did some research, and they said, well, who are low-income customers? College students, teachers. A lot of low-income customers are actually very educated. So they put some data together, and they went back and they told their regulators, listen, we think that not only would this time of use rate be something that would benefit our customers, we actually think that they're going to prefer it. And within a short amount of time, that rate actually had like a 96% approval rating. It was their highest, most well-received rate. In ERCOT, time of use rates are often provided by the rep, the retail energy provider. And I've been on a time of use rate for several years, and I'm very happy with it. I save a lot of money on it. I'm able to control my usage, and I don't think that I would control my usage the same way at all. In fact, I know I wouldn't, because when I know that I'm going to be using a lot, I'll roll over on a month-to-month fixed price plan and then roll back on the time of use. So anyway, just share that to say, it's so important to have these conversations around these policy tools and technologies with our regulators, and workshopping with REPs, with other utilities, to make sure that we have a well-founded consensus view on what would provide the most value.
I'm struck by the dichotomy between a time of use rate, which is pretty straightforward supply and demand issue that consumers in general understand. So if you overlay the consumer's understanding of that basic supply and demand structure with a distributed resource supply of power, and the price signaling that could be happening there, how do you think we need to prepare to educate the consumer to translate their understanding of that time of use rate on their distributed resource? Does that make sense? Good.
I think you're getting into the territory where the customer doesn't want to translate that. But I think it needs to be translated from a resource adequacy, system resiliency. This maybe not as well represented player in this conversation is a system operator, and they're looking at voltages and line capacities and things like that, and they probably see something that by some FERC orders, FERC 888, FERC 889, are separated from the marketing entity. But they're a key player because they can tell what resources, if we just think, let's just make the assumption that IoT and this third-party or utility-based white label aggregator platform is controlling load, and we've enabled it on our air conditioners and our refrigerators, whatever load we can move is being moved. The entity that really knows that is, if you look at the NERC functional model, which defines who's responsible for what on a reliability extent, that individual needs this information back to the standardization of data, and to know what, even down to the feeder, the distribution feeder, what can I do to alleviate this concern? And that's where I think if we look at the load as a resource, and we get the right information to the right people, and yes, there's a lot of work to do to get there. There's a lot of collaboration. There's a lot of conversations. There's a lot of not innovation-titled employees bringing groups to the table. But I think that's what I see. One other just thought is that a lot of the system operating limits are very static right now. They're based on worst cases and temperatures. If we can get that data on the ambient conditions and the flow conditions of the lines and stuff, to be calculating real-time these limits, your system operating limits, your interconnect reliability operating limits, there may be some flexibility of a limit that an operator just doesn't have an updated value to. He's looking for the transmission engineer to run a study to say what some condition can handle or not.
I do hope there's a day that we don't need to educate the customer on any of those things because they really don't need to know. It's difficult for an end user, a residential end user, but on the CNI side as well, just tell us what your budget is and tell us what your target is. You want to achieve zero carbon, fine. And with your budget, we can do this in X amount of years and just pay us something that's relevant to your budget as a flat fee. And we'll do that. We did that in Ohio State University as a company. So they're paying us essentially a fixed amount of payment every year. And there are essentially also bonus payments if we achieve targets early. And that's it. Very simple business model because Ohio State University is an academic institution. They need to focus on research. They need to focus on academics. They need to focus on providing affordable education for the students. They don't need to focus on how do they run their combined heat and power facility. They don't need to know that. And going back to the TOU rates, I live in Houston as well, and I actually use Griddy, which is essentially a wholesale pass-through power. So my rate essentially changes every 5 minutes. And the good thing that they've done is they've created a platform where obviously it's a very risky product because power prices, as we know, I think Chang talked about that in the summer where it was $9 per kilowatt hour. But they've created a platform where if the price spikes beyond a certain point, it can send a signal. And my Ecobee thermostat is essentially linked to their app and essentially shuts down my AC. I still use maybe 0.1, 0.2 kilowatt for that hour, but essentially I missed the price spike. So even though my rate changes every 5 minutes, I ended up paying, in Texas, our houses are huge, but still less than $300 for the given month, which is, I think, normal for any kind of rate. So if you provide the platform for the customer to engage the right way, I think the technology to solve these problems is already here.
Michael, do you have anything to add?
Well, I just wanted to share that I'm also a Griddy customer. And I did not have the same success. I had a $100 day in my home this last summer. And it's not because of anything Griddy did wrong. It's because my wife really does believe that our dogs need a house that's cooled to 72 degrees all day long.
Reality bites, doesn't it?
And I tried to communicate the price signals, but she was not hearing them because she did not care.
That's a good hurdle example of real world scenario. I appreciate the Ohio State example because when it came down to it, the customer understood the supply and demand issue and set a price, and it was up to the operator to figure out how to make that happen. We have just a few minutes. If there are any questions that you're burning to ask, now is your chance. Is everyone tired of listening to people pontificate? That's entirely possible as well. Chris, would you like a couple minutes back? Or do we need to continue to chat? Summarize and close up? Okay. This was something we talked about. If you had one word or phrase about the transformation of the grid and the role of renewables and other technologies in making it more resilient, what would you want to leave us with? Who'd like to go first? And this is a word or phrase. This is not a paragraph.
Okay, that will be tough, but I'll repeat what I said in the podcast. Data is the glue to achieving that goal, and regulators will need to start to be brave to make this happen.
I'm going to say electric vehicles. They're going to be the most transformational new load since air conditioning. And unlike your air conditioner, they have the potential of bidirectional flows. It's going to be massive. And we're talking about industrial, utility-sized batteries, but if the future shapes up the way we think it will, I mean, we're going to have so much distributed battery capacity in people's garages and parking lots that it's going to be revolutionary. Yep.
I want to say one size doesn't fit all. And I'm trying to say what might work in one scenario based on your regulatory structure, based upon how vertically integrated or not your utility, your distribution supplier is. You may have to look at a different solution.
Okay, y'all did a really good job of just a few words or a phrase, so thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists.